everyone, today I want to discuss a very common and, at times, frustrating experience that many of us face: being ignored. Whether it's in a conversation, a relationship, or at work, being ignored can leave us feeling hurt, confused, or even angry. However, how we respond to being ignored is key to our emotional well-being and growth. In this speech, I will explore how we should respond when someone ignores us and why it's important to handle these situations with grace and wisdom. When someone ignores you, it can be easy to jump to the conclusion that it's a personal attack. The emotional sting that comes with being overlooked or disregarded can leave us feeling hurt, rejected, or even invisible. However, one of the most important things to remember in these situations is that it's crucial not to take it personally. People's actions, especially when they involve ignoring or dismissing others, often have more to do with their own internal struggles than with you. It's easy to fall into the trap of thinking that their behavior is a reflection of your value or worth. But in truth, the reasons behind being ignored are usually far more complex than we might assume. People are constantly navigating their own emotional landscapes, facing challenges, dealing with stress, or processing their own issues. At times, they may be so caught up in their own world that they fail to engage with others, not out of malice or disregard, but simply because they are preoccupied. Sometimes their silence has absolutely nothing to do with you, but instead reflects something in their own life that they're working through. Whether it's personal problems, work stress, or even mental health struggles, there are countless factors that can cause someone to withdraw or distance themselves. It's also important to recognize that our perception of being ignored may not always be entirely accurate. There could be situations where someone doesn't intentionally ignore you but is simply distracted, busy, or unaware of how their actions are affecting you. Often we can misinterpret someone's lack of response as indifference, when in reality they may just be preoccupied or not know how to engage in that moment. By understanding that someone's failure to acknowledge you likely reflects their own experiences and not your worth as a person, you can begin to detach your emotions from their actions. This shift in perspective allows you to approach the situation with a more open mind, reducing the emotional weight of being ignored. It frees you from the trap of self-doubt and helps you maintain a sense of confidence and self-respect, regardless of how others treat you. In essence, not taking it personally is about recognizing that the way others treat you often speaks more about them than it does about you. By separating yourself from their behavior, you protect your self-esteem and emotional well-being, enabling you to respond with understanding and empathy rather than frustration and hurt. When faced with the situation of being ignored, one of the most powerful responses you can have is to stay calm and collected. It can be extremely tempting to react immediately when we feel hurt, rejected, or disrespected. Emotions can quickly bubble to the surface, and before we know it, we're reacting impulsively, whether by sending a snarky text, confronting the person in anger, or simply retreating into frustration. However, responding in this manner often leads to further misunderstandings, damaged relationships, or more emotional turmoil. Instead, taking a moment to breathe, reflect, and remain composed can significantly alter the outcome of the situation. When we are ignored, our first instinct might be to lash out, demand attention, or make the other person aware of how hurt we feel. However, acting out of anger or frustration rarely resolves the issue. In fact, it usually escalates the tension, making it harder for both parties to find common ground. Instead, if we remain calm, we create a space for more rational and meaningful communication. This gives us the opportunity to reflect on what's really happening, whether the person meant to ignore us, if there's an underlying issue we need to address, or if perhaps the situation is not as big as we initially believed. Taking the time to pause allows us to gather our thoughts and prevent knee-jerk reactions that might only lead to regret later. Remaining calm also helps to demonstrate maturity and emotional control, which can be incredibly beneficial in maintaining healthy relationships. Whether it's with a friend, a colleague, or a family member, staying level-headed shows that you are in control of your emotions and not easily swayed by temporary feelings. This kind of emotional stability builds respect from others and can even turn a potentially negative situation into an opportunity for growth or deeper understanding. Responding with grace rather than reacting in anger often prompts the other person to reconsider their behavior and may even encourage them to open up about what's been going on with them. The key is to give yourself permission to feel your emotions without letting them dictate your actions. It's perfectly okay to feel hurt or confused when someone ignores you, but the important thing is to not let those feelings control how you engage with the situation. By stepping back and allowing yourself to feel without reacting impulsively, you give yourself the power to choose how you want to move forward in a thoughtful and constructive way. This approach can prevent unnecessary conflict and preserve the integrity of the relationship, whether that's by giving the other person space or finding a calm moment to discuss the issue together. Ultimately, staying calm and collected is not about suppressing your emotions, but rather about taking the time to process them in a healthy way before reacting. This emotional maturity benefits both you and the other person involved, as it creates an atmosphere where communication can happen without the added stress of defensiveness or miscommunication. Before jumping to conclusions or responding hastily when someone ignores you, it's essential to take the time to assess the situation thoroughly. Often, our initial reaction is to assume the worst, that the person is deliberately dismissing or rejecting us. However, the reality may be much more complicated. Assessing the context of the situation can help you better understand why the person might not be responding, which in turn allows you to decide on the best course of action. Taking a step back and evaluating the situation objectively can help reduce misunderstandings and prevent unnecessary emotional turmoil. One important factor to consider is the person's current emotional or mental state. Are they going through a tough time or dealing with stress that could be affecting their ability to engage with others? Many times, people may withdraw or become distant not because they are ignoring us intentionally, but because they are overwhelmed with their own issues. Whether it's work pressures, personal struggles, or even just feeling mentally drained, these internal factors can cause someone to pull back from social interactions. Understanding this possibility can help you avoid interpreting their behavior as a personal slight. Instead, it may simply be a reflection of what they're going through at that moment. Another thing to consider is whether the situation involves a misunderstanding. Perhaps there was a miscommunication, or you might have unknowingly said or done something that made the person uncomfortable or upset. In these cases, the silence could be their way of processing their feelings or waiting for an opportunity to bring up the issue. It's important to give space for that, rather than jumping straight into confrontation. Sometimes the person may not know how to express themselves or may be uncertain about how to approach the situation with you. Taking a step back gives both parties the opportunity to cool down and reflect on what might have caused the rift. Often, giving it time will lead to a clearer understanding of the situation and a more productive conversation later. You should also take into account the external factors that might be influencing the person's behavior. For example, they might simply be preoccupied with other things. In our fast-paced lives, distractions are everywhere, and it's easy for someone to become absorbed in their responsibilities or tasks, leaving little energy or attention to spare for social interactions. They might not have consciously decided to ignore you, they might just have gotten caught up in something that demanded their attention. People are often juggling multiple priorities, and sometimes we end up on the receiving end of their distraction without it being intentional. Before reacting, try to consider the broader context and see if there could be an external reason for their behavior. It's also worth evaluating the relationship dynamics between you and the person. Is this something that has happened repeatedly, or is it a one-off occurrence? If this is a consistent pattern of behavior, it may indicate that there is an ongoing issue that needs to be addressed. On the other hand, if this is a rare occurrence, it might be worth considering whether you need to act immediately or allow the person the benefit of the doubt. Sometimes taking a moment to reflect on past interactions can help you better assess the present situation. If the relationship has been strong and positive up until this point, there's a good chance that the person's silence is temporary and can be resolved with understanding. In the end, assessing the situation is not just about determining whether you were wronged or misunderstood, it's about approaching the moment with a sense of curiosity and empathy. By reflecting on the circumstances surrounding the behavior, you give yourself the opportunity to see things from a broader perspective. This thoughtful approach helps to avoid jumping to negative conclusions and allows you to decide on the best response, whether that's offering understanding, waiting for clarification, or simply giving the person the space they need to re-engage. When someone ignores you, it can be incredibly tempting to push harder for their attention or to demand an explanation right away. However, one of the most important responses you can have in this situation is to respect their space. Sometimes when we are ignored, we feel compelled to make the person engage with us, often because of our own emotional need for closure or understanding. However, respecting their boundaries and allowing them time to process things on their own can not only help preserve the relationship, but it can also show that you understand and respect their personal needs. People need space for different reasons, whether they're feeling overwhelmed, anxious, or even upset, and forcing them to engage with us when they are not ready can cause more harm than good. It's essential to recognize that just because someone is ignoring us doesn't mean they want nothing to do with us. Often people need time to clear their minds, deal with their own emotions, or simply have some time to themselves. If we respond by pushing them to interact before they are ready, we risk making them feel cornered or pressured, which can lead to greater withdrawal or even resentment. Instead, by giving them space, you allow them the time they need to reflect on their thoughts or emotions and come back to the conversation when they are in a better place. This shows maturity on your part, as it signals that you are emotionally attuned to the other person's needs and willing to prioritize their emotional well-being. Additionally, respecting someone's space in these situations doesn't necessarily mean abandoning the relationship or forgetting about the issue. It simply means giving the other person the opportunity to work through their feelings in their own time. Relationships, whether personal or professional, require a balance of space and closeness, and respecting that balance is vital for long-term harmony. Everyone processes their emotions differently, and forcing someone to communicate before they are ready can lead to a breakdown in trust and understanding. Giving them room to breathe might even strengthen the relationship, as it demonstrates your patience, respect, and emotional intelligence. Another benefit of respecting someone's space is that it also allows you the time to reflect on the situation yourself. When someone ignores you, it's easy to become consumed by our own feelings of hurt or confusion. However, by stepping back and giving both parties the necessary space, you provide yourself with the opportunity to assess the situation more clearly. You can think about whether there's something in the dynamic that needs to be addressed, or if it's just a temporary issue that will resolve itself over time. Sometimes the best course of action for both parties is to allow emotions to settle, so that when you do communicate, it will be in a calmer, more constructive manner. In this way, respecting space is not just about the other person, it's also about taking care of your own emotional needs and ensuring that any future conversations are more productive. In addition, respecting their space can actually help avoid unnecessary tension. If you continue to push for attention, it may create an atmosphere of defensiveness or conflict, which only exacerbates the situation. On the other hand, by showing understanding and giving the other person the time they need, you allow things to cool down, which can make it easier for both of you to talk through any issues when the time is right. Sometimes the act of simply letting someone be is all they need to realize their own actions and return to the conversation with a clearer mind and a more open heart. Ultimately, respecting someone's space when they are ignoring you is not a sign of weakness, but rather of emotional maturity. It's an acknowledgement that relationships require both closeness and distance, and that sometimes the best way to preserve both is by allowing each other the time to reflect and process. When someone ignores you, it can feel incredibly disheartening, and in such moments, it's natural to want to react impulsively. However, choosing to respond thoughtfully and intentionally, rather than acting out of frustration or hurt, is often the most powerful and effective way to move forward. In situations like these, one of the best approaches is to carefully consider your next move and make sure it aligns with your values and the kind of person you want to be. This doesn't mean ignoring your feelings or pretending that you aren't hurt, but rather taking control of the situation in a way that reflects your emotional maturity and self-respect. How you respond in these moments can define not only your relationship with the person involved, but also your own sense of inner peace and confidence. The first thing to keep in mind is the importance of managing your emotions. When we feel ignored, it's easy to let our emotions take over. We might feel angry, rejected, or insignificant, and these emotions can drive us to lash out. However, reacting from a place of anger often leads to more harm than good. It's important to pause, take a deep breath, and give yourself time to reflect. Your initial emotional response might not be the most constructive way to address the situation, so it's important to give yourself the space to process what you're feeling before deciding how to act. It's okay to feel hurt or frustrated, but rather than allowing these emotions to dictate your actions, take the time to understand them. This creates an opportunity for you to respond in a way that is aligned with your values, maintaining your sense of dignity and integrity. Once you've given yourself time to reflect and calm down, the next step is to determine whether it's worth confronting the person at all. Sometimes when someone ignores you, the issue may not be as significant as it seems in the heat of the moment. Often time can provide clarity. There are instances when it's best to simply let things go and move on without confronting the person at all. If the person's behavior is a one-time occurrence or something that doesn't significantly impact you, it may be healthier to let it slide. Letting go of the need for constant validation or closure can be incredibly freeing. It's important to evaluate whether bringing up the issue will lead to a productive conversation or whether it's something that will only cause unnecessary stress or conflict. On the other hand, if you feel the need to address the situation, it's crucial to approach it in a way that is calm, respectful, and non-confrontational. Rather than accusing the person of ignoring you or blaming them for how you feel, try to approach the situation from a place of curiosity and understanding. Instead of saying something like, "You've been ignoring me and I don't appreciate it," you might say, "I've noticed that we haven't been communicating as much lately. Is everything okay?" This approach opens the door for honest communication without making the other person feel attacked or defensive. By framing the conversation in a way that encourages dialogue, you give the person an opportunity to share their side of the story and potentially explain why they've been distant or unresponsive. Another important consideration when choosing how to respond is whether this behavior is a pattern. If someone has ignored you multiple times or has repeatedly failed to acknowledge you, this may be an indication of a deeper issue that needs to be addressed. In these cases, it's essential to decide whether the relationship is worth maintaining and whether the person values and respects you. If the pattern of ignoring you is a consistent and recurring problem, it may be a sign that the relationship is unbalanced or unhealthy. In these cases, addressing the issue head-on may be necessary, not just for the sake of clarity, but to protect your own emotional well-being. Ultimately, how you choose to respond to being ignored should be guided by your own principles and emotional health. While it's easy to fall into the trap of reacting impulsively, a more thoughtful approach can prevent unnecessary conflict and help you maintain your dignity. Whether you choose to give the person space, confront them, or simply move on, the most important thing is that your response reflects your integrity and self-respect. You control how you react, and in doing so you ensure that your emotional needs are met in a way that aligns with your values and promotes healthy, respectful relationships. When someone ignores you, it's often an emotionally challenging experience that can leave us feeling vulnerable, rejected, or even frustrated. However, it's essential to remember that our initial reactions, whether it's to feel hurt, seek validation, or confront the person immediately, may not always serve us in the best way. One of the most valuable responses to being ignored is to acknowledge that people's actions may not always be a reflection of us, but of their own internal struggles or circumstances. This shift in perspective allows us to detach our emotions from the situation and prevents us from internalizing the negativity. It's common for us to immediately assume that someone is intentionally ignoring us, but this perspective often overlooks other possible reasons for their behavior, such as being preoccupied, experiencing personal stress, or going through something emotionally difficult. When we learn to step back and see the situation from their point of view, it helps us respond in a more balanced and compassionate way, rather than reacting impulsively out of hurt. Additionally, it's important to take into account that silence or ignoring can sometimes be a form of communication in itself. People may not always know how to express their feelings directly, and they may withdraw or retreat as a way of coping with overwhelming emotions. In such situations, it's crucial to avoid the impulse to bombard the person with messages or demand an explanation for their behavior. Pushing someone who is already retreating may create further tension and reinforce feelings of discomfort or alienation. Instead, by giving them the time and space they need, you are allowing them the opportunity to come forward when they feel ready. This approach fosters an environment of trust and respect, which is essential for any healthy relationship. People often need time to process their emotions or situations before they are capable of engaging in a productive conversation. Recognizing this can give both parties the room to breathe and reflect before addressing the issue in a way that is thoughtful and calm. Equally important is the ability to assess whether or not the person's behavior is intentional or accidental. At times, we may interpret a lack of response as an intentional slight or a form of disrespect, but it's crucial to consider the possibility that it could simply be a misunderstanding. There are numerous reasons why someone might not be responsive. They may be distracted, dealing with their own personal issues, or simply not realize that they are coming across as distant. Sometimes we can misinterpret silence as a deliberate choice when it might just be a result of forgetfulness or external circumstances. Before jumping to conclusions or reacting defensively, it's helpful to give the situation a little time. Waiting for clarity can help you avoid creating unnecessary conflict and give the other person the chance to explain themselves, especially if their behavior wasn't meant to hurt you. This patience and understanding can lead to better communication and help to rebuild any bridges that might have been unintentionally damaged. Another valuable response is to reflect on the nature of the relationship itself. If someone has ignored you once or twice, it's important to consider whether this is a rare occurrence or part of a larger pattern. If it's the first time it's happened, it may be worthwhile to let the person have the space they need without taking it personally. However, if this behavior has been a consistent pattern, it might be a signal that there are deeper issues at play. Sometimes we need to assess whether the relationship is reciprocal and whether it holds the value we place on it. If someone is regularly dismissing you or ignoring you, it could indicate that they are not fully engaged in the relationship, which may be something worth addressing. A relationship that continuously involves one person being ignored or disregarded can erode trust and self-esteem. In such cases, having a candid conversation about the relationship dynamic is important. Understanding whether this is a temporary issue or a sign of a deeper problem will allow you to decide how to move forward, whether that means addressing the situation, setting boundaries, or reevaluating the relationship altogether. Sometimes it's not about what the other person is doing, but how we respond that makes all the difference. When we allow ourselves to react emotionally in these situations, it's easy to get caught up in negative thought patterns or behaviors that don't serve us well. Choosing to take a step back and not engage in knee-jerk reactions allows us to preserve our own emotional stability. Responding thoughtfully rather than emotionally enables us to maintain control of the situation and not let external events dictate our mood or behavior. This emotional self-regulation is important because it prevents us from escalating the conflict and ensures that our interactions are guided by reason and clarity rather than frustration. By choosing a response that reflects our own emotional maturity and self-respect, we set a healthy standard for how we engage with others, regardless of how they may be behaving. Finally, responding to being ignored in a healthy way often involves taking responsibility for our own emotional well-being. It's important to recognize that while we can't control other people's actions, we do have control over how we choose to react. Sometimes this means letting go of the need for instant closure or understanding and allowing time for the other person to come around. It also means recognizing when a situation isn't worth investing further energy into, especially if the other person continues to disregard our needs or feelings. By taking ownership of how we process these emotions and allowing ourselves to move forward in a way that aligns with our values, we create the foundation for healthier, more balanced relationships. Not every situation requires a confrontation or an immediate solution. Sometimes simply allowing things to unfold naturally and giving space for things to settle is the best course of action. In this way, we prioritize our peace and emotional growth over the need for immediate resolution. When someone ignores you, it's natural to feel hurt, confused, or even angry. These feelings often arise because we associate being ignored with rejection, which can strike at the core of our emotional well-being. However, in these moments, one of the most valuable steps we can take is to shift our mindset away from the immediate sting of being ignored and instead approach the situation with empathy and a broader perspective. People's actions, especially when they involve silence or distance, are often more complex than we initially assume. Understanding this allows us to maintain a sense of emotional balance, rather than spiraling into negative thoughts and reactions. It's important to recognize that someone's choice to ignore us may stem from personal issues, external stress, or an internal struggle that has little to do with us. By stepping back and not immediately internalizing their behavior, we can preserve our emotional peace and avoid unnecessary conflict. Additionally, it's crucial to understand that ignoring someone is not always a deliberate or personal act. Often people withdraw because they're dealing with their own struggles or simply need time to themselves. They may be going through a period of stress or emotional overload that leaves them unable or unwilling to engage. In these cases, their silence is not a reflection of how they feel about you personally, but a reflection of what's going on in their own life. It could be something as simple as being overwhelmed with work, dealing with personal struggles, or even experiencing a moment of introspection. Rather than viewing their behavior as a rejection of you, it's helpful to consider that they may need space to process their own thoughts and feelings. This understanding can soften the emotional blow and prevent us from reacting out of hurt or frustration. It's also essential to consider whether the lack of communication is a result of misunderstanding or miscommunication. Often we can interpret silence as a form of indifference, when it may simply be that the other person is unaware of how their actions are affecting us. They may not realize that their lack of response is being perceived as intentional or hurtful. Sometimes people don't engage because they don't know how to address the situation or because they are uncertain about how to approach the person they're ignoring. In these situations, giving the person the benefit of the doubt can allow space for more compassionate understanding. Rather than assuming they are deliberately ignoring you, it's worth considering that their silence might be a sign of confusion or uncertainty. This mindset can help prevent the situation from escalating into conflict and foster a sense of mutual understanding when the time comes to talk things through. Another aspect to consider is how we can respond to being ignored without allowing it to define us. While it's natural to want closure or validation when we feel disregarded, we must remember that our self-worth is not dependent on the actions of others. People will inevitably behave in ways that we don't always understand or agree with, but it's important not to let their behavior diminish our sense of value. When we allow external actions, like being ignored, to define our self-worth, we give away our power. Instead, responding to being ignored with grace and self-assurance can reinforce our emotional strength. By maintaining our dignity and not reacting out of anger or neediness, we affirm our own self-respect and set a healthy boundary in our relationships. It's important to recognize that how others treat us is often more about them than it is about us, and this understanding allows us to keep our peace and emotional stability intact. In situations where being ignored becomes a recurring pattern, it's important to assess the overall relationship dynamic. If someone consistently ignores or distances themselves, it may signal an underlying issue that needs to be addressed. Relationships, whether personal or professional, thrive on communication, trust, and mutual respect. If one party is continually withdrawing or refusing to engage, it can lead to feelings of neglect or imbalance in the relationship. It's essential to evaluate whether this behavior is temporary or indicative of a deeper problem. If the situation is a one-time occurrence, it might be helpful to wait it out and give the person time to return to the conversation when they're ready. However, if the ignoring becomes a regular pattern, it may be necessary to have a direct conversation with the person involved. Addressing the issue in a calm and respectful way can help clarify the situation and ensure that both parties are on the same page. Another crucial step when dealing with being ignored is the importance of not chasing after the person who is distancing themselves. When we feel ignored, our instinct may be to repeatedly reach out, whether through messages, calls, or attempts to engage in person. However, this approach often leads to further frustration or even rejection. If the other person is withdrawing or choosing silence, constantly trying to break that silence can create an atmosphere of pressure, making the situation worse. Instead, it's better to allow the person space to come to you when they're ready. People need time to reflect and process their emotions, and forcing them to engage before they're ready can cause them to pull back even further. Sometimes simply stepping back and allowing the other person to make the first move can create a healthier dynamic, where both parties are more willing to communicate openly and honestly. Lastly, in situations where someone is persistently ignoring us, it's important to take a step back and reflect on the role we play in the relationship. While it's easy to blame the other person for their actions, sometimes we need to look inward and consider whether our own behavior may have contributed to the situation. Have we unintentionally said or done something that caused the other person to withdraw? Are there unresolved issues or past tensions that need to be addressed? Taking responsibility for our own actions and being open to self-reflection can help us better understand the dynamics of the relationship and improve our communication moving forward. This doesn't mean blaming ourselves or accepting mistreatment, but rather taking a proactive approach to understanding the root of the issue and making any necessary adjustments in how we interact with others. Ultimately, how we choose to respond when we are ignored plays a significant role in shaping the outcome of the situation. By approaching the situation with empathy, patience, and self-respect, we can navigate the emotional complexity of being ignored in a way that maintains our peace of mind and emotional strength. Whether we choose to give the person space, reflect on the relationship, or address the situation directly, the key is to approach it with a balanced mindset that prioritizes our emotional well-being and the health of the relationship. When faced with being ignored, it's easy to feel as though something is inherently wrong with us or the relationship. Our emotions can run high, and we might feel a deep sense of hurt, confusion, or even resentment. However, it's essential to step back and remember that someone's silence doesn't always reflect how they feel about us. Often their withdrawal or lack of response is influenced by external circumstances or their own internal struggles, which have little to do with us personally. Recognizing this allows us to avoid making assumptions or jumping to conclusions. It helps us understand that while we might be the ones receiving their silence, the reasons behind their behavior could be linked to things they are dealing with in their own lives: stress at work, personal challenges, or even emotional exhaustion. By adopting a more compassionate perspective, we free ourselves from taking their behavior personally, which gives us the space to respond in a way that is calm and measured, rather than reactive and emotionally charged. Moreover, understanding that people need time for personal reflection or dealing with their own issues can lead to more patience and tolerance. Sometimes when someone ignores us, it's because they are simply overwhelmed or don't know how to handle the situation at hand. They might be going through a stressful period or dealing with difficult emotions that leave them unable to engage with others. In such instances, their silence is not necessarily a judgment on us, but rather a response to their own emotional state. By respecting their need for space, we allow them to process their thoughts and feelings at their own pace. When we give them the time and freedom to work through their emotions without pressure, we contribute to a healthier and more understanding dynamic. This approach creates an environment where they feel safe to re-engage when they are ready, instead of feeling cornered or pushed into a confrontation before they're emotionally prepared. It's also worth considering that ignoring someone can sometimes be a form of self-protection. People might withdraw when they feel overwhelmed, frustrated, or even unsure about how to respond to a situation. If they've been hurt or upset by something that happened, they may need time alone to collect their thoughts and calm down. In these cases, their silence is not a rejection of you, but rather an attempt to preserve their emotional stability. When someone is processing hurt, fear, or anger, they might not feel equipped to have a rational or productive conversation right away. It's in these situations that offering space and showing empathy can be the best way to navigate the situation. We don't need to force a conversation or demand an explanation before the other person is ready to have it. Sometimes the most healing action is simply allowing the person time to process their emotions and return to the conversation with a clearer, more balanced perspective. On the other hand, it's important to be honest with ourselves about our feelings and intentions when someone ignores us. Our desire for validation or closure can be strong, but sometimes it's important to evaluate whether we need to seek answers or if we can find peace without them. When we approach a situation where we've been ignored, we have to decide whether engaging with the person is truly in our best interest or if we are simply seeking emotional reassurance. If the person's silence is a one-time occurrence or the result of a temporary issue in their life, it might be healthier to let the situation pass and give them time to come around. In these cases, we might be able to find peace within ourselves by accepting that some questions don't need immediate answers. Sometimes, simply allowing things to unfold naturally will lead to a more authentic and effective resolution than pushing for immediate closure. In some situations, ignoring someone can also be a form of avoidance, a tactic used by someone who is either unwilling or unsure about how to address an issue directly. This can be particularly challenging when it feels like the person is deliberately shutting us out, perhaps because they are afraid of conflict or uncomfortable with confrontation. In these cases, it's crucial to evaluate whether the relationship is built on mutual respect and open communication. If the behavior of being ignored becomes a regular pattern, it may indicate that the person is avoiding the necessary conversations that could lead to growth in the relationship. Instead of continuing to accept their withdrawal, it may be necessary to initiate a calm and direct conversation about the dynamic between you. By expressing your feelings without blaming or accusing them, you open the door to a more constructive dialogue. It's important to address these issues before they grow into larger problems that could erode the foundation of the relationship. Another important consideration is whether our response to being ignored will influence the long-term health of the relationship. When we feel ignored, we often want to react right away, whether through anger, frustration, or even attempts to force communication. However, how we respond in the moment can impact the future of the relationship. If we respond with aggression or frustration, we risk escalating the situation, which can create lasting tension. Conversely, responding with patience and empathy can lead to a more positive outcome, even if it takes time for the other person to open up. It's essential to keep in mind that relationships are built on a series of interactions, and the way we choose to respond when conflict arises can either strengthen or weaken the bond. By showing emotional maturity and understanding, we not only preserve the relationship but also set a healthy example for how to manage future challenges. At the same time, we must consider whether the relationship is one we want to invest in long term. If we are repeatedly ignored or made to feel insignificant, we need to assess whether the relationship is mutually fulfilling. Relationships, whether personal or professional, should be based on respect and consideration for one another's feelings. If someone consistently ignores us, it may be a sign that they are not prioritizing our well-being, and we may need to reevaluate the relationship. It's important to be honest with ourselves about what we need and whether we are being treated with the level of care and respect we deserve. If the dynamic is unbalanced or toxic, we may need to set boundaries or, in some cases, walk away from the relationship altogether. Knowing when to let go of a relationship that no longer serves us is a critical part of maintaining our emotional health and ensuring that we invest our time and energy in relationships that are reciprocal and respectful. Lastly, it's important to realize that being ignored doesn't diminish our worth. We are not defined by how others choose to treat us, and we shouldn't allow someone else's behavior to determine our emotional state. Instead, we should focus on maintaining our own sense of self-worth and emotional resilience. When we are ignored, it's easy to internalize the behavior and feel rejected, but in reality we are whole and valuable regardless of the actions of others. Taking responsibility for our own emotional well-being and choosing to not be defined by the way others treat us is one of the most empowering ways to navigate being ignored. By cultivating emotional independence and strength, we protect ourselves from the negative effects of others' behavior and create a sense of inner peace that cannot be easily shaken by external circumstances. In this way, we can move through the experience of being ignored without allowing it to disrupt our emotional equilibrium or sense of self. When someone ignores you, the immediate instinct is often to feel hurt or frustrated, as being ignored can trigger deep emotional responses. It's natural to interpret silence as a form of rejection or dismissal, which can lead us to feel insignificant or unimportant. However, one of the most crucial things to understand in these situations is that the behavior of being ignored is not always about us personally. People have different coping mechanisms and emotional triggers, and sometimes their silence or withdrawal reflects their own internal struggles. The other person's actions could be a result of stress, overwhelm, or emotional exhaustion, and not necessarily a reflection of how they feel about us. Acknowledging that their behavior may be more about their own state of mind than our worth can help us separate our emotions from the situation and avoid internalizing it in a negative way. This understanding allows us to maintain our emotional composure and prevents us from making assumptions that could fuel unnecessary frustration or resentment. Moreover, it's important to recognize that people's inability or unwillingness to engage doesn't always mean they are trying to hurt us. Often, when someone withdraws, it's because they don't know how to communicate their feelings or are struggling with something in their own lives. They may be dealing with personal stressors, feeling emotionally drained, or unsure of how to navigate the situation. In such cases, their silence is not a sign of disrespect, but rather a reflection of their own limitations or challenges. Instead of assuming the worst, it can be beneficial to consider that they may need time to process their emotions or simply need space to regain their energy. This empathetic approach not only reduces the emotional toll on us, but also fosters patience and understanding, which can strengthen the relationship over time. When we give the other person space to deal with their own issues, we create an environment of mutual respect where both parties can return to the conversation when they feel ready. Another aspect to consider when dealing with being ignored is the possibility that the silence might not be intentional at all. Sometimes people are preoccupied or distracted by their own concerns, and they simply forget or don't realize they are leaving us out of the loop. This can happen in both personal and professional settings, where people's lives are filled with competing priorities, making it easy for one person to unintentionally overlook another. In these cases, it's helpful to avoid jumping to conclusions and instead give the person the benefit of the doubt. By not immediately assuming that we've been deliberately ignored, we can avoid creating unnecessary conflict based on a misunderstanding. If this is a one-time occurrence, it might not be worth addressing at all. However, if the behavior becomes a pattern, it's worth considering whether it's something that should be discussed openly. Recognizing that people are human and sometimes prone to forgetfulness or distraction can help us approach these situations with more grace and less emotional intensity. On the other hand, if someone continues to ignore us despite repeated attempts to engage, it's important to assess the nature of the relationship. Is this behavior a rare instance, or is it part of a larger pattern? Relationships, whether they are friendships, family dynamics, or romantic partnerships, thrive on communication and mutual respect. If one person regularly withdraws or fails to acknowledge the other, it can lead to feelings of neglect and imbalance. In these situations, it's essential to have an honest conversation about the issue. Rather than lashing out or accusing the other person of intentionally ignoring us, it's important to approach the conversation calmly, expressing how the lack of communication makes us feel. By framing the conversation in terms of our own feelings and needs, rather than placing blame, we can open up a more constructive dialogue. This not only allows us to address the issue, but also gives the other person the opportunity to explain their behavior, which may provide clarity and lead to a better understanding of the situation. Another important point when dealing with being ignored is the impact of our own emotional response. It's easy to let emotions take over in situations where we feel disregarded, but choosing to react impulsively can often make the situation worse. Our first reaction may be to feel rejected, frustrated, or even angry, but responding immediately from this emotional state can escalate the situation unnecessarily. Taking a step back and giving ourselves time to cool down allows us to respond in a more rational and constructive manner. Emotional self-regulation is essential when navigating situations where we feel ignored because it enables us to maintain control over how we engage with others. By not reacting out of frustration or hurt, we create a space where the conversation can remain productive, and we prevent ourselves from saying or doing things we might later regret. Responding thoughtfully and without impulse helps us preserve our emotional well-being and maintain a sense of dignity and respect, both for ourselves and the other person involved. In some cases, being ignored might be a sign that the other person is disengaging from the relationship altogether. This can be a difficult realization, especially if we value the relationship and want to maintain it. If someone has been consistently ignoring us, it might indicate that they are no longer invested in the relationship or that they are pulling away for some reason. While this can be painful, it's important to assess whether the relationship is still serving us positively. If someone is choosing to withdraw and no longer makes an effort to engage, it might be a sign that they no longer see the relationship as important. In these cases, we need to evaluate whether it's worth continuing to invest time and energy into the relationship or whether it's time to move on. Relationships should be based on mutual respect, understanding, and communication, and if those elements are missing, it might be healthier to let go. Recognizing when a relationship is no longer fulfilling or when we are being neglected allows us to prioritize our own well-being and make decisions that support our emotional health. Another critical factor in dealing with being ignored is understanding the importance of setting boundaries. If we're constantly being ignored or neglected, it's crucial to establish boundaries that protect our emotional health. Sometimes people may ignore us because they know they can get away with it without any consequences. By setting clear boundaries, we communicate that we value ourselves and our time, and we will not tolerate behavior that diminishes our worth. Setting boundaries might involve expressing our need for clear communication or outlining the behaviors that are unacceptable to us. It's important to remember that boundaries are not about controlling others, but about protecting our own emotional space. By setting healthy boundaries, we teach others how to treat us and ensure that our relationships are based on mutual respect and understanding. Finally, it's important to remember that we have control over how we let being ignored affect us. It's easy to fall into the trap of seeking validation from others, but we must remember that our self-worth is not determined by how others treat us. Whether or not someone engages with us should not dictate how we feel about ourselves. In these moments, it's crucial to practice self-compassion and remind ourselves of our intrinsic value. We are worthy of respect and kindness, regardless of how others choose to behave. When we maintain this sense of self-worth, we can better navigate situations where we are ignored without allowing it to define our emotional state. By focusing on our own emotional resilience and self-validation, we can remain grounded and at peace, even in the face of challenging social dynamics.